Honorable Justices of the Constitutional Court of Lithuania, first of all, definitely I would like to thank you for inviting us to this conference, to this gathering, to have a couple of days of being in the atmosphere of the family, of colleagues, especially when you are so far from every day and every night air signals calling to go to shelter. And this is really the best privilege we could have these days. Thank you very much for that. And as well, my sincerest congratulations for both dates, for both anniversaries, the centenary and the 10th anniversary on two constitutions, which are remarkable dates for the whole Lithuanian nation. So congratulations. And now about lessons. Some about lessons. Maybe, so on the one hand, lessons not for only constitutional courts. On the other hand, lessons also for constitutional courts as well. Ladies and gentlemen, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 marked the liberation of Central and Eastern Europe from almost half a century of a totalitarian Soviet rule. Since then, almost all the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, with the only exception that Belarus, have become the members of the Council of Europe, adhering to the foundational values, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law as an obligation under Article 3 of the Council of Europe Statute. Thus, all the so-called new democracies agreed to abide by the Council of Europe standards and undertook to remedy shortcomings in their constitutional, political, and legal orders as part of the membership package. In addition, more than half of the so-called new democracies at a later stage also joined the European Union, which shares the same foundational values. For 20 years after the fall of communism, there was a strong belief that a basic level of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in these countries had been achieved, and that the break with the totalitarian past was irreversible. There were grounds to believe also that the difference between the so-called core Western democracies, from which the rule of law originated, and the EU's newest members regarding the stability of institutions guaranteeing democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, the so-called the Copenhagen criteria, had been erased or at least reduced to a minimum. However, as practice shows, since 2000, some Central and Eastern Europe countries have experienced a deterioration of democratic rule and rule of law backsliding, breaching the foundational values of both the Council of Europe and the EU. Scholars in the field of public law and political science struggle to understand the nature of the evolving threats to a wide range of democratic systems. Many terms have been used to hide the contemporary authoritarian mask as constitutional democracy. These present a kind of a conceptual bazaar involving, for example, abusive constitutionalism, autocratic legalism, populist constitutionalism, bad faith constitutionalism, constitutional retrogression, constitutional capture, constitutional rot, constitutional decay, etc. We are talking about a kind of contemporary authoritarianism that is characterized as a sui generis system between constitutional democracy and dictatorship. So the lesson to be learned is that over the past 20 years, we have witnessed a decline of constitutional democracy across the whole Europe, covering even the European Union, the area where it was least expected. However, when talking about the EU, we are talking not about the whole region, definitely, but only about the developments of definite decline of the constitutional democracy occurring most acutely in some Central and European and Eastern European states. Under these circumstances, the judiciary and the constitutional courts have had to find their own institutional independence while under threat from the governing party in political institutions, which has led to antagonism between them. The crisis of constitutional democracy is especially worrying in two EU member states, I will not name them, where the rise of abusive constitutionalism struck the domestic judiciaries particularly hard and led to a course of systemic undermining the rule of law. In this context, we observed how political governing majorities in several new democracies of Central and Eastern Europe have attempted to exert influence over the functioning of constitutional institutions. Legislative and executive authorities have tried to bring them in line with political objectives, as well as to make them subservient or even to block their work. I would mention some forms of this activity. That is, an attempt everybody could find in which country this happened. An attempt to actually abolish the Constitutional Court, a tactic to budget reduction of the Constitutional Court, non-appointment of the Constitutional Court judges, packing the Constitutional Court, dismissal of the Constitutional Court judges, non-implementation of the judgments, irregular appointment or election of duplicate Constitutional Court judges. So that was, if I have 2 minutes, maybe 3 or 4. Because why? Because I was intending to speak 10 minutes, but these okay, I keep it as it is. This is where my reflections on the lessons from the past, and especially lessons which can be drawn regarding the demands imposed on candidates by the EU in the future enlargement rounds. So this is where lessons from my reflection on the lessons from the past that do matter for the future. However, I propose the consideration of another issue. Can history draw lessons from the future? I mean lessons from the future that is still being written. It is not yet unwritten. A future where Putin's unprovoked invasion of not only Ukraine, but European democracy in general ends in Moscow's defeat. When Ukraine wins, one of the powerful lessons will be, I quote, bystanders will realize that democracy is not weak, but provides the legitimacy, solidarity, and steadfastness necessary for victory. The world will also see that the United States, its European allies, and their democratic partners will sacrifice to help an embattled democracy defend itself and to reaffirm the most vital principle of international order, that territorial aggression will not stand. Finally, it will demonstrate the disastrous incompetence and miscalculation of Putin's authoritarian state, and thus illustrate a larger lesson. When leaders are not constrained by checks and balances, the alternative flows of information, they are prone to ruinous blunders. Yet another lesson tells us now how about the danger of the cost of democracies doing business with autocrats and dictators, about the fault of Western democracies that did not react in timely, accurate, and effective manner to a whole series of aggressions committed by Russia in the past. It's not only about annexation of Crimea and the occupation of part of Ukraine's territory in the east in 2014. It is also about even earlier Russian aggression against Georgia, even earlier Russian intervention into Syria, Venezuela, etc. So, as a result, we are living in a world in which international institutions tend out to be, well, ill-equipped or unwilling to maintain democracy, human rights, the rule of law, peace, and security that are their raison d'être. Among such institutions, and I am finishing, that is only 1 or 2 minutes, among such institutions, first of all, are United Nations and the Council of Europe. By the way, both of which were founded under the slogan, never again. However, it did happen again. That is why, more than ever, since the time when the United Nations and the Council of Europe were founded. The words of Winston Churchill, one of the founding fathers of the Council of Europe, are relevant. 76 years ago at the University of Zurich, on September 19, 1946, he said, I quote, "The League of Nations did not fail because of its principles or conceptions. It failed because those principles were deserted by those states which brought it into being, because the governments of those states feared to face the facts and act while time remained. This disaster must not be repeated." The end of quote. This disaster had repeated itself. It continues, primarily because Ukraine was attacked by Russia, to stop its 30-year independent the European democratic trajectory. Today's Russia is a terrorist tyranny, aptly expressed as Russism, a specific modern form of fascism rooted in Bolshevik totalitarianism. Ukrainian resistance to Russism is a confirmation of the fidelity of the Ukrainian nation to principles of democracy and its future. Professor Timothy Snyder of Yale University has justly said that Ukraine holds the future, and that this war is about establishing principles for the 21st century, that it is about policies of mass death and about meaning of life in politics, that is about possibility of a democratic future. So, I conclude, Russian fascism has posed a challenge to all humanity. We live in times of a global struggle between two political systems, democracy and autocracy. As Joseph Borrell more precisely stated at the EU Annual Conference 2022, I quote, "There is a fight between the democratic systems and the authoritarian systems, but authoritarianism is unhappily developing a lot. There is an authoritarian trend. Sometimes they are still wearing democracy suit, but they are no longer democracies," end of quote. So, if democracy and the rule of law are the global values, the struggle for the future world in which they predominate should be accordingly global as well. And that struggle begins here in Europe. Thank you for your attention.